at the spa across the campus green in the basement of Case College Center immediately following this event. In this evening's reading, I'm Bob Boyers. I will introduce Campbell McGrath, and Elizabeth Benedict will introduce Michael Ondaatje. There are so many things to love and admire in the poems of Campbell McGrath that it is always hard for me to know where to start in preparing an introduction. About the music, there can be little quarrel. Campbell has, no mystery, a wonderful ear. His lines rush forward with a profusion and a gorgeous sufficiency that no good reader can fail to appreciate. So too with the intricacies of phrasing and metaphor that manage somehow to seem natural, even casual, as if this poet thought pretty much all the time in just this way, not needing to dress up for special occasions, but instead always primed to make the language dance and strut its least hour upon the page. But the gift, the prodigious way with language and inflection, is in some odd way almost the least of it. For this is a poet of very high ambition, which is to say that he is always after more than he can fully express. Though he is and has always been an abundant writer who doesn't hold back, who is willing to try 1,000 ways of getting at what he feels and means, he is also a writer for whom the target seems always out of reach or even at times beside the point. He has an appetite for the wild and the immeasurable, though he proceeds always with at least 1 foot securely on the stable ground. The lemons he spies at the side of a road may be, as he says, too fragrant, too glorious for words, but that doesn't stop him from attempting to do them delicious justice, while looking out for other uncompassable wonders, like the young green shoots of the pruned grapevines ascending madly from their trellises, striving for vindication, for consummation. Just there, you hear the characteristic McGrath note, the abundance, the fascination with things ascending madly, and the reach, the instinct to go for something more than mere wonder or description, the drive to press on, from lemons, from a rock song on the radio, from pruned grapevines or the vagrant bark of a dog, to press on to another calling. In this case, the striving for vindication, for consummation. Though just how exactly we are to read and understand that striving, the poem doesn't quite allow us to know, doesn't want us to know. So that we say that risk is central to the work of this poet. There is, we feel, in much of his work what can best be called a ravishing lack of prudence. This poet likes, wherever possible, to let himself go. He is not afraid of excess, not at all, and he won't hold back in his sometimes ecstatic embrace of the natural world, or in his alternative, heartfelt celebration of the ordinary domesticities. To be sure, he is often most thrilled and thrilling in his attraction to unseeable galaxies or atomic particles. He is, to be sure, a poet in thrall much of the time to what he calls almanacs of wonders. He adores maelstroms, mixings, motion, speed, and yet he is no doubt about it, for all of his inspired investment in the unfathomable, a poet who knows how to sing the pleasures of the small, the near to hand, the hamlet in the valley, the town at the next hillside, risk and consolation, voyaging out and voyaging in, order and disorder, the torn and the whole. These are the measures that so move us to astonishment and pleasure in the work of this poet, Campbell McGrath.
A cabinet of wonders in the very introduction. Thank you, as always, Bob, for the superfluity of that. Welcome. It's great to be here. Thank you all for being here. It's always wonderful to read here. It's such a wonderful, as we all always repeat ourselves saying, place to be for us, the writers. It's a real pleasure to read with Michael Ondaatje tonight, too, since I still recall talking with him 5 years ago about poetry and prose and some of the ways they infiltrate each other. And I was at work at the time. My last 2 books have been book-length projects, and that was really of great use to me in the ensuing years. I'm going to read all new work tonight. Well, having said that, let me just recall that my last book, Shannon, is a book-length poem of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Buffalo, Buffalo, Buffalo. So we've dispensed with Shannon for those of you. Now we can move forward to entirely new work. I have a new book coming out in February. The book's called In the Kingdom of the Sea Monkeys. It's warm in this room, but not nearly as warm as our classroom. I notice most of my class here. It has come up in class several times this week already, the poet George Oppen. The new book is about a lot of things. One of the things it's about is American poetry. I'm going to start with 3 poems. I'm probably going to read a dozen poems. 3 poems that touch on American poetry. The first is called simply George Oppen. The way we live now, the larger portions people are so delighted with, new facilities, new buildings lost in sheen, blurring the eyes to make the synchronized fountains at the food court resemble art. More Hockney than Hopper, more Crane than Williams, this, the new loneliness, the new conformity. Consumer-colored clouds adrift in a mall-colored sky as the movie-colored dusk displaces the cautionary previews of sunset, and the stars emerge, self-conscious as adolescents, modeling frosted lip gloss in a window of bright merchandise, numerous and alone. This poem's called Allen Ginsberg. I met him only once, at a party in Vinnie Katz's old apartment above a Thai restaurant on 55th Street in Chicago, spring of 1983 or 84. Earlier that evening, he gave a reading at the university, finger symbols, ashram chanting, not as much of the early ecstatic genius as had been hoped, not the majestic anguish of Howell, but a serious performance nonetheless, warmly greeted by an audience of many hundreds. It seemed even more crowded at the party, where Vinnie's band, The Throbbers, a loose-jointed Velvets-inspired power trio, rattled the walls of the linoleum-tiled kitchen as we did our usual thing, menthol cigarettes and aggressive dancing, cheap liquor sloshed from aluminum ashtrays, a lot of ironic social commentary on second-hand couches smelling of smoke and cat piss. Ginsberg sat hunched in a back room, Buddha-like, holding court. The omnisexual dimension of his Socratic shtick was a bit unnerving. Even worse was the way Peter Orlovsky would flick the tip of my nose with his finger as I posed burning questions like, "Why did Kerouac have to die, man?" He seemed tired, sure. How many times had he been through this routine? How many earnest young poets dreaming of glory, looking for wisdom or validation or whatever? How many dim bohemian scenes edging toward ash-blistered dawn? But his patience never faltered, his tipsy smile. He never sold out the night or the life or the art that counted him as a bead on its prayer string. And then it was dawn, or something like it, near dawn, Chicago, though it could have been New York, Denver, San Francisco, the American city in all its splendid yearning to be lost and longing to belong, its sidewalks of dog shit and sparkling mica, a train passing over the viaduct, the embankment spectral with waif paper and what I took to be ghost weeds trembling in the vinegar light. Not weeds, but coarse flowers risen from the pavement. Not ghosts, but souls seeking voices to greet the dawn. A prose poem called West Virginia. It references James Wright, and James Wright, grew up in a river town on the Ohio side of the industrial West Virginia-Ohio border. It talks about the James Wright Poetry Festival that used to be held every year, but has stopped now in his hometown of Martins Ferry. Sitting alone in a bar in West Virginia, watching Monday Night Football, I come to consider the beauty of bartenders and their metaphorical resemblance to angels. Today's incarnation is Fallon, streak of white dyed in her jet black hair, now doing shots at the bar with Rick, her sometimes boyfriend, who loves above all else, playing music, always at it, only missed 3 days of practice in the last 2 years, and that to go fishing with his brother. Rick is learning funk bass to accompany the bluegrass guitar he cut his teeth on back home in Nashville, which explains why he keeps requesting songs by the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Lord, nobody in the entire state of Tennessee but plays in a band, singing about lions and buried treasure in the sweet flesh of the beloved. Rick tells me he was born in 1984, and I tell him that in 1985 I saw the Red Hot Chili Peppers play these very songs at a club in New York City. A fact alluded to in a poem I read earlier this evening to a room full of college students, many of whom, never having been to a poetry reading before, asked me as they exited to sign my name on their Xeroxed programs, either to prove their attendance for extra credit or as if it were the autograph of a minor celebrity, a versifying Red Hot Chili Pepper descended from the library shelf. We are not far from James Wright's hometown, which can no longer afford to celebrate its famous son with the touchingly sentimental poetry festival named in his honor. A literary event unlike any other in this country, held in the very library in which he discovered the books that enabled his escape from that town of retired factory hands on front porch lawn chairs. A town of abandoned mills and bars, not unlike this one, wedged between the railroad tracks and the Ohio River. A good-looking bartender is a dangerous benefactor, bestower of mercy and of temptation in like measure, mercy which may also be oblivion. Next week, I'll be sitting in a bar in Central Europe, drinking the local Pilsner named after a golden pheasant, which I believe without ever having tasted to be delicious. Faith in the instruments and their servants, faith in good beer to come, faith that the Cowboys will lose, as they do, on a field goal in overtime. Draw a circle. Whatever's inside it is the poem. Everything else is the world. Keep drawing that circle larger and larger. Keep going. Keep going. This poem was written on the back of a Jack Daniels coaster at a bar in Morgantown, West Virginia, which may, after all, explain a few things. Poetry and fiction. Their affair has been tempestuous, and then some. Like us, they like to get it on, to rut and hump, bang a gong, but then grow sullen, wondering not if but when the end will come. He says to her, "You're not all pretty flowers and hippie skirts, bitch." And she, "If you want to switch genres, go buy a thesaurus. Don't just mope around all morose and quasi-narrative." And so it goes. They criticize each other's clothes, her eye for art, his ear for music. Then they hit the sack and pledge to give it one more chance. Theirs is a heterotextual romance. The Foghorn. The poem one is writing is like a racehorse, running at a pace partially of one's choosing, partially a function of conditions on the racecourse, and partially determined by the horse's breeding. But the poem one is going to start immediately, very soon, perhaps next March, is like a foghorn calling mournfully in the night. If only the moon would concede its guilt and come to heel like an obedient dog. If only the horse could transform into a yacht. If only the poet were a sailor or fog. There's a fog theme in these three poems. There's a poem called An Irish Word. Canny has always been an Irish word to my ear. So, too, its cousin crafty, suggesting not only an appreciation of close work, fine making, hand-wrought artistry, but a highly evolved reliance on one's wits to survive, stealth in the shadow of repressive institutions, silence, exile, and cunning in Joyce's admonition, ferret sly, fox quick, silvery and elusive. Craft, akin to croft, a shepherd's crooked hawthorn staff, wind polish wolds and peat-spent moorlands high in the Blue Stack Mountains. Akin to draft, a pint of creamy stout, or a good stout draft horse, or a drafty old house like the one in which my grandfather was born near Drimnahurk, slate-roofed, heart-angled, ringed by thistles in a soil-starved coombe. His four brothers left home bound for Australia, South Africa, Liverpool, and Los Angeles, losing track of each other at once and forever, as if to loose the hawsers and set sail were to sever every filial tether. His name was Francis Daniel Campbell, but my grandmother Anna was a Monaghan, and her people had been Maguires, Morans, Mohans, Mehans, and other alliterative slant-rhymed clans, all the way back to the nameless bog-dwellers and kine folk. When her father died suddenly in New York, he left 3 baby daughters and a widowed seamstress with no recourse but retreat to the old Rose Cottage overlooking Donegal Bay, in a parish of trellised thorns and ricked hay, taking in mending and needlework to eat. Market days, they rode the train into Derry to sell embroidered linens and hand-tatted lace, kerchiefs monogrammed Z to A. She was nearing 30 when she married and recrossed the Atlantic, and from her, my own mother had a recipe for soda bread, piles of drop-stitch tablecloths, and a small stoneware pitcher hand-painted in folksy script, "Be canny with a cream." Nothing could move my brother and I to screams of laughter like that tiny pitcher, so serious of purpose, so quaintly archaic, as we slurped down bowls of frosted flakes before school in the breakfast nook. The scrupulous economy of the world it bespoke, the frugality toward which it gestured, were as inscrutable to us then as the great sea cliffs at Slieve League when we drove to the top at Amhark Moor on a road so thickly fleeced with mist we might have been lost if not for the sheep materializing like guardian imps, imperturbable creatures, black-faced ifrits, the ocean one vast invisible gong like that phone struck by padded mellets or mailed fists. Amhark Moor means the grand view in Irish, but all we saw was fog. One more poem about fog. It's called Fog. Driving down F Avenue on a foggy day in B, the cab driver, a Russian, tips back his head at a stoplight and falls fast asleep. No car behind us, neon signs muted, everything hushed, adrift. After a moment, I reach to touch his shoulder, and his eyes slowly open. Sorry, he says, I was dreaming, and drives on. Dick Cheney speaks to me in a dream. The tree wells with sap. The sponge expands with brine. A dish rag yields so much before it wrings dry. It ends, it concludes, it terminates. And you would tremble with fear to hear the briefings, to see the demarcated targets, a certain fast food restaurant where the women resemble butchered turkeys in running shoes and polyester pants, obese children waving their sad little baloney arms. This was a McDonald's in Ohio, I believe, but I can't speak to that directly. I cannot stipulate Ohio or possibly Oklahoma. I do not recall the particulars or choose not to. An heuristic of blindness, if you will. The point is this. These are the lame zebras, the slow wildebeest at the watering hole, and the judicious response is to cull the herd. A calibrated rebalancing, akin to natural selection, which by no means contradicts intelligent design. Survival of the fittest is a free market paradigm. And we have a full menu of implementation options. Amazing, some of the prototypes I've signed off on, the know-how, the technology of this ordinance. To reflect honestly, I am awed at our place in the schema. I am awed at the nimbus, almost a translucency, the light shining right through solid objects. We have so much to be thankful for, and the prisoner wants to take that from us, but he will talk, and when he does, we will have the right team in place, the appropriate people to make sense of his jabbering, officers and specialists, magnificently trained, folks who have dedicated their entire lives to this pursuit. Freedom is a tough monkey, but we will make him sing. Vice President of Pants. This is unrelated to the previous poem, entirely so. I have a friend in Miami who works in the clothing manufacturing business, and I knew he was an executive in a clothing company. I never knew what he did exactly until an article in the newspaper was printed during the very height of the recession about people whose salaries had been slashed, and it revealed what his former salary had been and also what his new salary was, both of which were shocking. And also that his title was Vice President of Pants. And seemingly things couldn't really get any funnier, but having just seen him not that long ago, his new title after a promotion is, and this is really true, President of Men's Bottoms. And that sounds like another poem, but I haven't gotten to that poem yet. Vice President of Pants. Vice President of Pants turns out to be my friend Marvin's job title at a local clothing manufacturer, as I learned from a recent newspaper article about victims of the downturn. Though even after serious erosion, his paycheck rolls enough bi-weekly zeros to belie whatever expectations you may have harbored about those who toil in the vineyards of leisure wear. And I can't help but envy the director of knee socks and the undersecretary of ascots, and wonder whether the alcalde of Guayaberas might be hiring an assistant sometime soon. Because, in all honesty, this poetry gig is like feeding donuts to a hungry tiger or planting sunflowers on the moon. I'm going to read 3 more poems. that was all that stuff was from the book that's coming out. I read some poems from that previous year's here, but I don't think I read any of those. Next year I'll read the last couple that are left that I haven't read. I'm going to read 3 more poems, and that's from forward-looking books. I think I mentioned here before last year, I'm writing a book about the 20th century. The premise of the book is it's 100 poems long, one for each year of the 20th century, written in different voices, of historical figures, some of whom become recurrent, like Pablo Picasso, some of whom speak only once. And I think I read a Picasso poem the other year. I remember talking about it. Anyway, after 1962, when I'm born, I become a character in the book. And so I'm going to read you one of those poems, which is called simply 1986. My 5-year tour of duty in New York fell during that era when it was dubbed, not without affection, New Calcutta. Tail end of a decades-long cycle of civic and social change that left a dank, uneasy detritus at the turn of the tide. Homeless men would wander into the local diners to drink bottles of watery ketchup off the lunch counter before they could be hustled back out the door to Amsterdam Avenue. The 103rd Street subway station resembled Beirut, shattered tiles cascading from collapsing walls, stairwells with handrails torn from their stanchions to rust in puddles of urine. Everything so far beyond broken as to be worthless, scabbed with filth and graffiti, and the lone transit worker in his bulletproof booth peeking warily from beneath the brim of his uniform cap, like the citizens staring out through gated windows as if to ask, what the hell happened? Ebb years, which engendered an inevitable counterflood toward law and order, primness and conformity, just as the new formalists rose against the laxist practices of free verse to trumpet the familiar praxis of meter ruled with metronomic regularity, tuck-pointing brownstones, renaming neighborhoods, pushing the street people further into the outer boroughs as the lucre that primed the pump began to gush anew. New York City can teach you anything. Yiddish opera to extreme martial arts, 3-card Monte to leveraged buyouts. But what I learned in those years is that what I was learning was not a field of inquiry, but a way of life, a calling, devotion to a muse who for all her unforgivable beauty was merely one daughter of the cloud-begirt kingdom of art. Those were the last years of my grandmother's life, and I would sometimes ride the subway to 168th Street to visit her claustrophobic apartment in Washington Heights, where my parents had been children when Upper Manhattan was a shtetl of Viennese Jews fleeing the specter of Anschluss, and Broadway a bourne for thirsty Irish immigrants. When the cure for a hot summer evening was to ride the open-top Fifth Avenue bus from Van Cortlandt Park to Washington Square with your ringleted sisters harmonizing hit songs by Perry Como and Doris Day. At her funeral there was more bitterness than sorrow, and afterwards we were shanghaied on a nostalgic tour of the old neighborhood. Blocks of neglected tenements become a teeming, salsa-toned Dominican barrio, arguing over which building Ralphie DeSoto had lived in, where the parish boundary for St. Rose of Lima fell, pausing before the most abject crack house to recall the way a ham sandwich wrapped in wax paper might be expertly tossed from a 4th-story window if you forgot your lunch on the way to school. Where did that world of stickball and buffalo nickels go? Where now is Ralphie DeSoto, Perry Como, Pee Wee Reese? Where are Hart Crane's angelic sailors carousing these days? Where have the new formalists vanished to? Whitman's ferry-bound Bowery boys, Carl Solomon's ghost. Where else but the past? A river much like the Hudson, tidal, dynamic, cliff-bound, estuarine. Its source hidden in pine-covered mountains, and its mouth disgorging dioxins and milk crates and sea bass and lost souls relentlessly into the cold, salt flux of the Atlantic. These are 2 brand new poems that I don't know where the heck they're going to go in life. The first one is a pentatina, and that's a new form I've just invented in the last 3 weeks. And a pentatina is not like a sestina, but instead of operating on a principle of sixes, it works on fives. There's only 5 stanzas, 5 lines in each stanza, and 5 end words. But they're not end words, they become beginning of the line words. But then they rotate in the same way they would in a sestina. And in this pentatina, I don't know if it's true for all pentatinas, I haven't decided yet, every line also ends with a rhyme based on a vowel sound, so it goes A, E, I, O, U. So this is called pentatina for 5 vowels. And the repeat words are today, the past, nothing, love, and the future. Today is a trumpet to set the hounds baying. The past is a fox the hunters are flaying. Nothing unspoken goes without saying. Love's a casino where lovers risk playing. The future's a marker our hearts are prepaying. The future's a promise there's no guaranteeing. Today is a fire the field mice are fleeing. Love is a marriage of feeling and being. The past is a mirror for wishful sightseeing. Nothing goes missing without absenteeing. Nothing gets cloven except by dividing. The future is chosen by atoms colliding. The past's an elision forever eliding. Today is a fog bank in which I am hiding. Love is a burn forever debriding. Love's an ascent forever plateauing. Nothing is granted except by bestowing. Today is an anthem the cuckoos are crowing. The future is a convolute river on-flowing. The past is a lawn the neighbors are mowing. The past is an answer not worth pursuing. Nothing gets done except by the doing. The future's a climax forever ensuing. Love is only won by wooing. Today is a truce between reaping and ruing. Final poem. It's a poem called Releasing the Sherpas, which is, I guess, about relinquishing what has aided you on the journey, on the ascent. The last 2 Sherpas were the strongest, faithful companions, their faces wind-peeled, streaked with soot and glacier light on the snowfield below the summit where we stopped to rest. The first was my body, snug in its cap of lynx fur, smelling of yak butter and fine mineral dirt, agile, impetuous, broad-shouldered, alive to the frozen bite of oxygen in the larynx. The second was my intellect, dour and thirsty, furrowing its fox-like brow, my calculating brain, searching for some cairn or chasm to explain this rash decision to send them back without me. Looking down from the next axe-cleft Sirac, I saw them turn and dwindle, but felt unafraid. Blind as a diamond, sun-pure, rarefied. Whatever I was then, there was no turning back. Thank you.
He is a man of many countries, a man of many gifts. He makes films, he edits anthologies and a literary magazine. He teaches, and, you may have heard, he writes poetry, fiction, and autobiography. Several years ago, he conducted a series of conversations with film editor Walter Murch and made a book of them that is no less fascinating than his other writing. Before the international success of The English Patient, Michael Ondaatje was what is known as a writer's writer. After that, after the Booker Prize and the Academy Award-winning film, he is known as a famous writer, full stop. Along with the general adjectives used to describe his work, brilliant, ravishing, original, powerful, The more specific words are exotic, imaginative, poetic, atmospheric, morally complex, and structurally fragmented. He follows the command, write what you know, but he does that by learning a great many new things, the wondrous, the arcane, the highly technical, with each new book. His texts are rich with history, incident, geography, the horrors of war, the weight of family, the power of lust, and the intricate details of all sorts of professions: musician, bridge builder, nurse, forensic anthropologist, gambler, thief, and sapper. It is to be expected that a child taken from his home, Sri Lanka, at the age of 11, as Ondaatje was, and sent to live on another continent, minus one of his parents, would have a profound sense of what exile, upheaval, and belonging mean. It is not then surprising that Ondaatje's characters are often outsiders and misfits, runaways and orphans. He's also drawn to the fictional possibilities of certain real people who fit those descriptions, including Billy the Kid, the jazz musician Buddy Bolden, and Laszlo Ede Almase, a Hungarian diplomat and desert explorer who inspired the character of the English patient. His characters don't live in the suburbs or wonder where to go on vacation or whether couples counseling will hold a broken marriage together. Their lives are altogether more surreal, mythic, and improvisational. The worlds they inhabit feel sometimes like traveling circuses. Remarkably colorful characters blow into town, tell us fantastic stories, and drift away without warning, as though we might have been dreaming. In a public conversation about influences earlier this year with Robert Haas and Michael Chabon, Ondaatje said that painting had been more of an influence on him than had film, and he named a major mural by Diego Rivera in Detroit and the work of collage artist Kurt Schwitters. He said, quote, "If I could steal any painting, I would steal a Kurt Schwitters collage." He was fascinated, he explained, by the art of putting a blue piece of paper next to a yellow and at the same time making the blue thick and rough and the other smooth. For practical purposes, I suppose, he did not express a desire to steal the Diego Rivera mural. He just described it as having at one end a representation of a man holding up a wrench, and at the other, in an almost identical gesture, a man holding up a pencil. As he considered the mural, he said, this is one way to structure a novel, as much as the Jane Austen novel plan. What makes him fantasize, I wonder, about stealing a Schwitters instead of buying one or being given one? Each, I imagine, is as unlikely as the others. True, there is a certain lovable thief who makes appearances in 3 of his novels, a man by the name of Caravaggio. He never steals from houses he's been invited into and notices while breaking and entering when the Advent calendar is open to the wrong day. I'm not sure that Michael Ondaatje has larceny in his heart, but he does seem to have an appetite for a certain kind of aesthetic mischief. Not quite a Dadaist who throws up a handful of colored papers and calls wherever they land a work of art. He works in fragments, building characters and story piece by piece with little or no idea where it will all lead. Then, as he explained to Walter Murch, I move things around till they become sharp and clear, till they are in the right location. And it is at this stage that I discover the work's true voice and structure. This, too, might fall broadly into the category of mischief. Embedded in Ondaatje's fiction are reading lists, writing lessons, even reading lessons. In The English Patient is a volume of Herodotus's histories that is also the man's scrapbook. A faithful husband's favorite book is Anna Karenina. And right in the middle, In the Skin of a Lion, is the best advice ever on writing and reading novels. The first sentence of every novel should be, he wrote, "Trust me, this will take time, but there is order here, very faint, very human. Meander if you want to get to town." The Michael Ondaatje novel plan requires much more than that. Try it at home if you dare. In the meantime, please join me in welcoming Michael Ondaatje again to the Writers' Institute.
Thank you very much. This book I'm going to read from, this new book, has been so secret for so long that it feels almost bizarre to actually talk about it tonight, and not alone read it. It's a story of an 11-year-old boy who is put on a ship to go from Sri Lanka to England. I don't know where I got that plot from, but I have to say it is a novel. And on this trip, he's traveling alone, and there are two other boys that he makes friends with. One named one named Cassius, and one named Ramadan. And these two are his pals, and they get into trouble constantly on this 21-day journey. It takes place in the 1950s, and one of the things the boy misses most of all is the smell of the country he has left. And I'm going to read about 3 or 4 sections from it. This is the right one, yeah. One day I began to smell burning hemp on the ship. For a moment I stood still, then moved towards the staircase where it was stronger, hesitated about whether to go up or down, then climbed the stairs. The smell was coming from a corridor on D level. I stopped where it seemed strongest, got to my knees, and sniffed at the inch of crack under the metal door. I knocked quietly. Yes, I went in. Sitting at the desk was a gentle-looking man. The room had a porthole. It was open, and the smoke from a rope whose end was burning seemed to follow a path over the man's shoulder and out the porthole. Yes, he said again. I like the smell. I miss it. He smiled at me and gestured to a space on his bed where I could sit. He pulled open a drawer and brought out a coil of rope a yard long. It was the same sort of rope, hemp rope, that hung slowly burning outside the cigarette stalls in Bambalapitiya or the Petar market, anywhere in the city, really, where you lit the single smoke you had just bought there, or, if you were running and wanted to cause a disturbance, you used the end of the burning coil to light the fuse of a firecracker. I know I shall miss it too, he said. And other things, kotamali, balsam. I have such things in my suitcase, for I am leaving forever. He looked away for a moment. It was as if he had said it aloud to himself for the first time. What is your name? I told him. If you are lonely, he said, you can always come here. I nodded, then slipped out and closed the door behind me. His name was Mr. Fonseca, and he was traveling to England to be a teacher. I would visit him every few days. He knew passages from all kinds of books that he could recite by heart, and he sat at his desk all day wondering about them, thinking what he could say about them. I knew scarcely a thing about the world of literature, but he welcomed me with unusual and interesting stories, stopping abruptly in mid-tale and saying that someday I should find out what happened after that. You will like it, I think. Perhaps you will find the eagle, or they will escape the maze with the help of someone they are about to meet. Often during the night, while stalking the adult world with Ramadan and Cassius, I'd attempt to add to the bare bones of an adventure Mr. Fonseca had left unfinished. He was gracious with his quietness. When he spoke, he was tentative and languid. Even then I understood his rareness by the pace of his gestures. He stood up only when it was essential, as if he were a sick cat. He was not used to public effort, even though he was now going to be a part of a public world as a teacher of literature and history in England. I tried to coax him up on deck a few times, but his porthole and what he could see through it seemed enough nature for him. With his books, his burning rope, some bottled Killarney River water, as well as a few family photographs, he had no need to leave his time capsule. I would visit that smoky room if the day was dull, and he would at some point begin reading to me. It was the anonymity of the stories and the poems that went deepest into me, and the curl of a rhyme was something new. I had not thought to believe he was actually quoting something written with care in some far country centuries earlier. He had lived in Colombo all his life, and his manner and accent were a product of the island. But at the same time, he had this wide-ranging knowledge of books. He'd sing a song from the Azores or recite lines from an Irish play. I brought Cassius and Ramadan to meet him. He had become curious about them, and he made me tell him of our adventures on the ship. He beguiled them as well, especially Ramadan. Mr. Fonseca seemed to draw forth an assurance or a calming quality from the books he read. He'd gaze into the unimaginable distance. One could almost see the dates flying off the calendar, and quote lines written in stone. I suppose he remembered these things to clarify his own opinions, like a man buttoning up his own sweater to give warmth just to himself. Mr. Fonseca would not be a wealthy man, and it would be a spare life he would be certain to lead as a schoolteacher in some urban location. But he had a serenity that came with the choice of the life he wanted to live, and this serenity and certainty I've seen only among those who have the armor of books close by. I'm aware of the pathos and the irony that come with such a portrait. All those foxed penguin editions of Orwell and Gissing, and the translations of Lucretius with their purple borders that he was bringing with him. He must have believed it would be a humble but good life for an Asian living in England, where something like his Latin grammar could be a distinguishing sword. I wonder what happened to him. Every few years, whenever I remember, I will look up a reference to Fonseca in the library. I do know that Ramadan kept in touch with him during his early years in England, but I did not. Though I did realize that people like Mr. Fonseca came before us like innocent knights in a more dangerous time, and on the same path we ourselves were taking now. And at every step there were no doubt the same lessons, not poems, to learn brutally by heart. Just as there was the discovery of the good and cheap Indian restaurant in Lewisham, and the similar opening up and sealing of blue aerograms to Ceylon and later to Sri Lanka, and the same slights and insults and embarrassments about the pronouncing of the letter V, and our rushed manner of speaking, and most of all the difficulty of entrance, and then perhaps a modest acceptance and ease in a similar cabin-like flat. I think about Mr. Fonseca at those English schools wearing his buttoned sweater to protect himself from English weather, and wonder how long he stayed there, and if he did really stay forever, or whether in the end he could no longer survive it, even though for him it was the center of culture, and instead returned home on an Air Lanka flight that took only 2/3 of a day to begin teaching in a place like Nugegoda. London returned. Were all those memorized paragraphs and stanzas of the European canon he brought back the equivalent of a coil of hemp or a bottle of river water? Did he adapt them or translate them, insist on teaching them in a village school on a blackboard in the sunlight, the rough call of forest birds screeching nearby, some idea of order at Nugegoda? The voice kind of moves from the 11-year-old to now and then to an older voice, and then back again. This is the 11-year-old voice. Our ship continued to move northwest, crossing into higher latitudes, and the passengers could feel the nights becoming cooler. One day we were told over the loudspeakers that a film would be shown after the dinner sitting on the deck outside the Celtic room. By dusk, stewards had set up a stiff sheet at the stern and brought out a projector which they covered mysteriously. Half an hour before the film began, about 100 people had made a restless audience, the adults sitting on chairs, the children on the deck itself. Ramadan and Cassius and I got as close to the screen as possible. This was our first film. There was a loud crackling in the speakers, and suddenly images were thrown onto the screen, which was surrounded by a receding purple sky. We were just days away from landing in Aden, so the choice of the 4 feathers was, I see now, somewhat tactless, as it attempted to compare the brutality of Arabia with a civilized, though foolish, England. We watched an Englishman having his face branded. You got to hear the sizzle of his flesh, so that he could pass himself off as an Arab in an invented desert nation. An old general in the story referred to the Arabs as something like the Ghazara tribe, irresponsible and violent. Later, another Englishman was blinded by staring at the desert sun, and he wandered slowly around for the rest of the film. As for the subtler issues of jingoism and cowardice in a time of war, those were blown away by the strong winds in the passing ocean. The sound system was not good, besides which We were not used to atonal English accents. We simply follow the action. There was also the possibility of an additional subplot, for our ship was approaching a storm zone, and if we turned our heads away from the drama on the screen, we could see forks of lightning in the distance. The movie, as we rolled under the gradually disappearing stars, was being shown in 2 locations. It had begun half an hour earlier in the Pipe and Drums bar in first class, projected to a quieter group of about 40 well-dressed passengers. When the first reel was over, that segment of the film was rewound and carried in a metal container down to our projector on deck for its al fresco showing, while the first-class audience watched the second reel. As a result, there were confusing fallouts of sound that merged the 2 screenings. The volume on each speaker was turned to maximum because of the roar of the sea winds, and we were constantly assaulted by contrapuntal noises. While watching a tense scene, we could hear rousing songs in an officer's mess. Still, our alfresco showing had the atmosphere of a night picnic. We were all given a cup of ice cream, and as you waited for the first-class reel to be over and then threaded it onto our projector, the Junkler troupe performed. They were doing a juggling act with large butcher knives. Just at the moment, we heard the bloodthirsty screaming of attacking Arabs from the first-class screening. The Junkler troupe was parodying these yells with comic body movements. And then the Hyderabad mind stepped forward to announce that a brooch someone had lost the day before could be found hanging over the projector's lens. And so, just as first class was witnessing a brutal massacre of English troops, exultant cheers rose from our audience. Our film proceeded on the seemingly live canvas of a flapping screen. The plot was full of grandness and confusion, of acts of cruelty that we understood, and responsible honor that we did not. Cassius would go around for days claiming to be part of the Oronze tribe, irresponsible and violent. Unfortunately, the anticipated storm burst loose over the ship, and as the rain hit the projector, the hot metal began hissing, a steward attempting to hold an umbrella over it. A gust ripped the screen loose and sent it skittering over the ocean like a ghost, and the images continued to be shot out targetless over the sea. We never learned the end of the story, not on that journey. I did a few years later by reading A.E.W. Mason's novel in the Dulwich College Library. He turned out to be an old boy of the school. In any case, that night saw the beginning of violent storms that assaulted the Oronze. It was only after this was over that we escaped the turmoil of the ocean and landed in the real Arabia. Perhaps it had been the failure of that film to satisfy us. I still cannot explain why we did what we did then. It may simply have been because it was to be our first sighting of a storm at sea. After the projector had been rolled away and the chairs stacked, there was a sudden lull upon the ocean and in the sky above us, so that now, even though we were told that the radar had blinked the existence of another approaching upheaval, the winds had quieted, and this gave us time to prepare ourselves. It was Cassius, of course, who persuaded me into the best seat in the house for the catastrophe. We talked it over by the lifeboats. Ramadan did not wish to participate, but he offered to help set it up. A day earlier, we had come across some ropes and tackle in a storeroom that had been left open during the lifeboat drill. And so that night, during the lull, while nearly all the other passengers returned to their cabins, we made our way to the open promenade deck near the bow and found various permanent objects we could attach ourselves to with ropes. We heard the captain announce that they were expecting a 50-knot gale and to prepare for the worst. Cassius and I lay on our backs, side by side, and Ramadan began to tie us with ropes to some V-shaped rivets and a bollard. He was hurrying, for he could see the storm coming. He checked his knots in the darkness and left us there, spread-eagled and tightly harnessed. The deck was deserted, and not much happened for a while, save for a light rain. Perhaps we had veered away from the storm, but then the gale hit and pulled the air out of our mouths. We had to turn our heads away from its rush in order to breathe, the wind buckling like metal around us. We'd imagined lying there, conversing in wonder about the lights of the storm at some great height above us. But we were now almost drowning from the water and the air, the rain and the sea that was leaping over the railings and swirling across the deck. Lightning lit the rain in the air above us, and then it was dark once more. A loose rope was slapping at my throat. There was only noise. We could not tell if we were screaming or only trying to. With each wave, it sounded as if the ship were breaking apart, and with each wave, the wash covered over us until we were tilted upright again. We were aware of a constant rhythm. Whenever the ship plowed into the oncoming sea, we were swept around within the surf, unbreathing, while the stern rose into the air, the propellers out of their element, screaming, till they fell back down into the sea, and we on the bow leapt up again, unnaturally. As I lay on the promenade deck of the Oronze during those few hours, when we believed we had given up any chance of our lives, everything coalesced. I was something orderless and ajar, unable to escape what was happening, unable to get out of what was occurring. All I held on to was that I was not alone. Cassius was with me. Now and then our heads turned simultaneously in the lightning, and we each saw the blunt, washed-out face of the other. I felt I was caught in this place. If and when the ship pivoted its nose down and descended, overcome by some towering wave, Cassius and I would still be permanently tied to a pump generator or some such thing. There was no one else. We were the only ones on the surface of the ship, as if staked out for a sacrifice. The waves shattered, rolled over us, and disappeared overboard as quick as a nightmare. Then we rose. Then we dropped into the next valley. All that was holding us to safety was Ramadan's slight knowledge of knots. What did he know of knots? We assumed in our death throes that he had no knowledge of them. We were not safe at all. There was no sense of time. How long were we there before we were blinded by the searchlights focused down from the bridge onto the two of us? Even in our frayed state, we sensed the outrage behind the light. Then it went out. Later we learned all the names for storms: chubasco, squall, cyclone, typhoon. And later we were told what it was like below deck, how the stained glass windows in the Caledonia room shattered and the electrical circuits burned out almost at once, so there were flashlights moving up and down the hallways, swaying their beams into the bars and lounges as people searched for missing passengers. Lifeboats broke partially free of their davits and hung tilted in midair. The ship's compasses spun. Mr. Hasty and Mr. Invernio were in the lightless kennels attempting to calm the dogs, tormented by the thunder in their ears. One wave hit the assistant purser, and the force of it washed out his glass eye. All this while our heads were stretched back to try and see how deep the bar would go on its next descent. Our screams unheard, even to each other, even to ourselves, even if the next day our throats were raw from yelling into that hallway of the sea. It seemed like hours before someone nudged me. The storm was still active, but calm enough now to send 3 sailors out to our rescue. They cut the ropes, the swelling knots had fused, and we were carried down a flight of stairs to a dining cabin that was doubling as a medical center. There had been a few bashes to the head and broken fingers during the last hour or two. We were stripped down and each given a blanket. We were told we could sleep there. I recall that when I was lifted by the sailor, there was such warmth in his body. I remember that when someone removed my shirt, he said that all of our buttons had been knocked loose. I saw Cassius's face as if all intricacy had been washed away. Then, just before we fell asleep, Cassius leaned over and whispered, "Don't forget, someone did this to us." This is later in the journey. We approached the Suez Canal in darkness at the stroke of midnight. A few passengers camped on the decks to take in the experience, but were half asleep, scarcely conscious of the clangs and bells that guided our ship into the narrow eye of the needle that was El Suez. We paused to take on an Arab harbor pilot who climbed from his barge up a rope ladder. He walked slowly towards the bridge, ignoring all authority around him. This was his property now. He would be the one to take us into even shallower waters and adjust the angle of the ship so we could slip into the narrower canal on which we would travel the 190 kilometers to port side. We could see him in the brightly lit horizontal windows of the bridge beside the captain and two other officers. It was a night we never slept. In less than half an hour, we were sidling alongside a concrete dock with crates stacked into giant pyramids and men running with electrical cables on baggage carts alongside the slow-moving ship. Everywhere there was fast, intense work under the pockets of sulphurous light. The three of us hung over the railings, gulping in air, taking it in. This night turned out to be our most vivid memory of the journey, the time I stumble upon now and then in a dream. We were not active, but a constantly changing world slid past our ship, the darkness various and full of suggestion. Unseen tractors were grinding along the abutments, the cranes bent low, poised to pluck one of us off as we passed. We had crossed open seas at 22 knots, and now we moved as if hobbled, at the speed of a slow bicycle, as if within the gradual unrolling of a scroll. Bundles were being flung up onto the foredeck. A rope had been fastened to the railing so a sailor could swing himself down to the passing land to sign territorial papers. I saw a painting leave the ship. In my sidelong glance it appeared familiar. I might have seen it in one of the first-class lounges. Why would a painting be removed from a ship? I could not tell whether everything taking place was carefully legal or a frenzy of criminality. For only a few officials oversaw what was going on, and all the deck lights were out, and all activity was hushed. There were just the lit windows of the bridge, with the three constant silhouettes, as if puppets guided the ship, following the orders of the harbor pilot. He came out a few times onto the open deck and whistled into the night to instruct a man he recognized on shore. A concurring whistle replied, and we'd hear the splash of a dropped chain, and the bow of the ship would jerk suddenly to re-angle itself to one side or the other. Ramadan kept running up and down the length of the ship. Cassius and I perched precariously on the bow railing where we could witness the fragmentary tableaus below us, a merchant with his stall of food, engineers talking by a bonfire, the unloading of refuse, all of this we knew we would never see again. So we came to understand that small and important thing, that our lives could be large with interesting strangers who would pass us without any personal involvement. I remember still how we moved in that canal, our visibility muted, and those sounds that were messages from shore, and the sleepers on deck missing the panorama of activity. We were on the railing, bucking up and down. We could have fallen and lost our ship and begun another fate, as paupers or as princes. "Uncle," we shouted, if someone was close enough to distinguish our small figures. "Hello, uncle!" And people would wave, fling us a grin. Everyone who saw us sliding by was an uncle that night. Someone threw us an orange from the desert. Cassius kept shouting for beaties, but they did not understand him. A dock worker held up something, a plant or an animal, but the darkness disguised it too well. No other vessel would be traveling that night in the canal's dark waters. Radio contact had been at work for more than a day, so that we would enter as we had to at the very moment of midnight. Under a swaying cord of electrical light, down there on shore, was a man sitting at a makeshift table, filling out forms he handed to a runner, who caught up with the ship and flung the papers with a metal weight, so they landed at the feet of one of the sailors. We never stopped moving. We passed the runner, as well as the man at the table furiously recording the charts of exchange, and a canteen cook beside an open fire roasting a thing whose odor was a gift, a desire in the night, a temptation to abandon the ship after all the European food we'd been eating for days. And Cassius said, "That is what frankincense smells like." And so our ship continued, guided by these strangers. We were collecting what was fresh from land, bartering for objects thrown on board. Who knows what was exchanged that night, and what cross-fertilization occurred as the legal papers of entrance and exit were signed and passed back down to land, while we entered and left the brief and temporary world of El Suis. We drifted into morning light. Clotted clouds speckled the sky. We hadn't seen clouds for our whole journey save the dark mountains of them that banked above our ship and fell upon us during those storms. Then, approaching port side, a sandstorm rose up and hung over us, a last gasp from Arabia that caused havoc with the ship's radar signals. This was the reason our arrival at SWI had been carefully timed to begin at midnight, in order that we might reach port side in daylight, when navigation could be based on what could be seen with human sight. So we entered the Mediterranean with our eyes wide open. There was a time in my late 20s when suddenly I had an urge to meet Cassius again. While I had kept in touch with them and spent time with Ramadan and his family, I had not seen Cassius since the day our ship docked in England. And during this period, when I had the desire to meet him, I came across an announcement in a London newspaper. There was a photograph of him. I would not have recognized the face except it had his name beside it. Older, darker, as different as I probably was from the boy I had been on the ship that year. It was an advertisement for a show of his paintings. And so I went into the city to a gallery on Cork Street. I went there not so much to see his art as to make contact with him, to have, I hoped, a long meal together and talk and talk and talk. I knew little of what had happened to him since our 3 weeks together, although I knew he had become a well-considered painter. That had surprised me. But was he as wild, I wondered? And had he remained as dangerous as he seemed to me when I was a boy? Some grains of Cassius had, after all, remained in my system. I looked again at the announcement I had cut out of the paper, at that picture of him leaning against a white wall with a hint of belligerence. But Cassius was not there. It was a Saturday afternoon. I got to the gallery and was told the show had opened a few evenings earlier, and that Cassius had made his appearance then. I did not know much about the habits of the art world. It was a disappointment, but his absence did not matter. For what I saw in the paintings was Cassius himself. They were large canvases that filled the 3 rooms of the Waddington Gallery, about 15 of them, and they were all about that night in SWI. The very same sulphur lights above the night activity that I still remembered, or at least began to remember that Saturday afternoon, and the open fires, the ancient-looking logbook being filled urgently by the scribe at the table in the crisp night. I thought the paintings were abstractions at first. There was a sense in them that things were taking place on the edge or just beyond the painted colors. But once I knew where we were, everything altered. I even found Ramadan's small dog gazing up at the boat. All this enlarged me, and I did not know why. I suppose it clarified how close Cassius and I had been, real brothers, for he also had witnessed the people I saw that night, with whom we had felt so oddly aligned, whom we would never see again. Only there, in that night city of another world. We had not talked of this, but it had somehow come to both of us, and now they were here with us. I walked over to the visitor's book, where people were expected to write comments. Some of them were quite grand, overly intellectual. Some just said delightful. A loose scroll that took up a whole page said, "Little old lady got mutilated late last night." It must have been written by one of his drunken friends. No one else had written on that page, and the sentence exposed itself there, quite solitary. I put down the date, and I wrote, "The Oronze tribe, irresponsible and violent." Then I added, "Sorry to miss you." I left no address. I went outside, but something else held me, so I decided to walk through the gallery again. This time, glad there was hardly anyone there. And when I understood what it was that drew me, I circled the gallery once more to make sure. I read somewhere that when people first celebrated the distinct point of view of Latigue's early photographs, it took a while before someone pointed out that it was the natural angle of a small boy with a camera looking up at the adults he was photographing. What I was seeing now in the gallery was the exact angle of vision Cassius and I had that night from the railing, looking down at the men working in those pods of light, an angle of 45 degrees or something like that. I was back on the railing, watching, which was where Cassius was emotionally when he was doing these paintings. Goodbye, we were saying to all of them. Goodbye.